Hello and welcome to Australia in Focus, the podcast where Australian and international doers, thinkers and changemakers dive into the issues shaping Australia. I'm Danny Hunter, founder and principal of Hunter Collective and your host of Australia in Focus. In each episode, we'll explore the complex challenges, innovative solutions and transformative ideas driving our nation forward. By diving deep into the here and now and looking ahead at what's possible, Australia in Focus is bringing you the conversations that matter, the conversations that illuminate the path to Australia's future. Hello and welcome to this episode of Australia in Focus. I'm Danny Hunter, your host, and I'm so excited today to be here with Paul Sakkal. Welcome, Paul.
Hey, Danny. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. I'm so excited to talk to you today because this is a really interesting topic. I'm going to introduce you in just a moment, but I'll let everyone know that today, Paul and I are going to have a discussion about the way Australians engage with politics and the media, particularly in the age of social media, AI, and the rapid rate of the news cycle. Paul, you are a leading political correspondent with The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. You're based in Canberra. So you're right in the thick of it, especially as we get up to a federal election later in 2025. You're the winner of 2 Walkley Awards and 3 Quill Awards. Congratulations. You were essentially, before you went into the federal political reporting scene, you were the king of the Victorian political scene for the 9 newspapers. Your knowledge about politics and media has really been enhanced over a stellar career, both as a journalist, but also as a really active commentator on media and politics in Australia. You appear on Insiders for the ABC on Sunday mornings, which tragics like me really enjoy. And you're here to share your insights into how Australians are engaging with politics and the media in today's modern age. Welcome.
That's a ridiculous pump up, Danny, but I'll take it.
I'm good at the pump up. I enjoy getting everyone that's listening to know who we're talking to and why. So let's kick off with a little bit more about you, Paul. I'd love to hear a summary of your career highlights and tell us a little bit about what drove you into journalism, particularly into political journalism.
Yeah, I had an odd pathway into political journalism and journalism generally. I studied an arts degree at Melbourne University. I majored in international studies and politics and economics. I ended up getting a minor in economics because I didn't apply myself strongly enough. And I was keen on kind of entering the political world. I worked for a lobbying company called Hawke Britton in Victoria, which was heavily involved in lobbying the Victorian government on a whole range of matters, particularly the Labor Party. It's a Labor-aligned firm. And I was kind of on that pathway to becoming a political staffer. I was obsessed with politics from a young age, didn't really see any other path in my career that I was interested in. I read a lot of news as a kid. I read newspapers from a very young age. The Herald Sun and The Age were often on the kitchen table when I'd rock up in the morning in my family home. So I was always interested in journalism and the media, but really never thought I would practice it. The opportunity came up in 2018 at The Age to be a junior journalist there in the cadet intake that they hadn't done for about 6 years, I think, prior, or maybe 5 years, because that was a really bleak period in media when there were a lot of job cuts. That opportunity came up. I had a go. I was urged by people at The Age who I knew to have a crack. I thought I wouldn't get a job there really, because they were hugely sought after positions, and was lucky enough to get one, and then really never looked back and loved the job. It's exhilarating. Being involved in political reporting means that I still am able to pursue that interest of mine, but just from a different vantage point, being a reporter and trying to get in the thick of it and learn things and put them out into the open rather than being in the places where those decisions are made.
Well, that's right. You kind of went from somewhat of the inside, or at least the periphery of the inside, to the outside as more of an objective observer. And I'm assuming you would have seen a lot of big shifts throughout your career in terms of how Australians engage with politics through the media. Tell us a little bit about that and how you've had to evolve potentially even your journalism style to ensure that people remain engaged and that people remain engaged with the journalism that you're producing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've only been a journalist for 6 or so years, but there's been massive change, as you suggest, just in that time. I mean, the information, the way people glean information and where they gather their news of the world is just so diffuse these days. I remember in probably the mid part of last decade, I think there would have been a bigger proportion, and stats bear this out, of people my age who read news websites. Now, there are often things that I'm writing about or issues that are being debated in the mainstream press that my friends who are a similar age to me, so young adults starting their careers in corporate world or wherever they might be, they're actually just not aware of things that are kind of in mainstream political debate. They're getting their information from social media platforms, which we're going to go into later. And there's also just this huge reckoning that's occurred across the world about the kind of trustworthiness of the press. I mean, Donald Trump is obviously emblematic of that rise in hostility towards mainstream journalists. The idea of fake news is pervasive now. And so it's a debate that permeates the whole industry, this question of how do we remain trusted? How do we remain relevant when people can gather information in so many different types of free ways? And how do we prove that we are doing good for democracy rather than actually corroding it?
What do you see as journalism's role in that effort to do good for democracy? What's the role of journalism?
Well, the Fourth Estate has been an absolute pillar of democracy. The idea is that journalists probe power, hold it to account, and ensure that decisions are made in a fair and just way that's in the public interest. The risk, and I think this is something that the rise of Trump and populist movements across the West have bore out, the risk is that journalists miss the ways in which governments and elites are running societies, and miss the ways in which certain marginalized groups are perhaps not achieving fulfillment or the same level of well-being as the winners in society. And if the mainstream press appears to big sections of the society as if they are overlooking them, overlooking their instincts, their attitudes, their sense that traditional values are being diminished across society and their place in the world is becoming more frazzled, then as an institution, the Fourth Estate loses its prestige. And so I think that's something that more and more journalists are realising. It's a difficult thing to adjust to, and it's not clear what the long-term solutions are, but I think there is a greater understanding that journalism has perhaps, as I said, overlooked in some cases the fissures occurring in society.
Do you think journalism is going to get better at that? Do you think there's enough, demand in terms of clickbait and headlines v really in-depth and appropriately covered issues?
Yeah, well, I think what you're saying now is, and particularly if you look in the US, is just that there's so many different, and people are going people seeking a certain type of news coverage are going to one small segment of the news industry and getting the type of information they seek from that organization and consuming very little else. People on TikTok who are seeking, right-wing populist opinion, they have an algorithm that's attuned to them and they're getting that information and not consuming much else. People who are interested in environmental news in Australia who want it written from a left-wing perspective are reading The Guardian and not much else. So we're just seeing this siloed effect and a hollowing out of journalism that is designed to be from the centre, looking outwards in a non-biased way, which is a troubling trend. And we're seeing that influence the way people vote and the way people think about politics and the way people engage with their fellow citizens.
Well, this is a really interesting stat. There are 20.8 million social media accounts in Australia, which means almost 80% of us are using social media. And as you said, that social media algorithm context is really important, and it seems to be increasingly dictating what we see and what we consume on social media. So how do you think these platforms, and there is a different influence between, say, Instagram, Facebook and TikTok and LinkedIn, for example, they have different impacts, they have different audiences, but how are they affecting our political views and also the way that we consume news?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I think it's fascinating the amount of time that is spent debating what is talked about on Twitter, now X, because the proportion of people in America and Australia who actually use that platform is actually quite small. I think the stats are at something like 6, 7, 8 or 9%. But
it's
there are
journalists and political staffers.
100%. And I'm not sure if you're on there anymore. Are you still on there?
No. I think I have an account, but I haven't found any value in it for years.
Well, it's a much healthier way to live to be off it. I've tried to wean myself off, but it's actually an addiction, and I inevitably find myself back on there. But as you say, because there are so many political staffers, journalists, politicians, and others in the kind of establishment bubble on that platform, it dominates the way those people on the platform believe discourse is playing out, even though some of these conversations are sectional and not being held widely in the public. Because algorithms, which are designed literally to get their claws in our brains and keep us attached, because they enhance contentious posts and spread them because controversy is more interesting than banality, fringe opinions can often be overrepresented on social media. So rather than free and open public forums, critics would argue that social media offers a distorted, kind of sensationalized mirror of public sentiment that muffles or kind of masks the views of the silent majority. And this leads to, politicians using inflamed language, a sense that fringe actors are actually a much bigger force than they are.
Well, and it's that, and I don't know about you, but I certainly am guilty of sometimes being addicted to the scroll. And it translates not only from scrolling through Instagram or LinkedIn, which are my two sort of primary social media accounts, but also to simply scrolling headlines on news apps. And so instead of taking the time to get in there and get into the depth of an article and the analysis, sometimes I'm just looking at, well, what's happened or what's that person saying? And then I move on.
Yeah.
And I'm an avid consumer of news. So and that's probably a really bad habit to admit to. But unless I sort of have the time to sit down with the coffee, which doesn't happen every day because of my two small kids, it's sometimes a case of just really trying to absorb as much of small, short bites as I can to feel like I know what's going on in the world.
I hope you still pay for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and subsidise my salary.
I pay for all of them. Yeah. And it's a joy. Like I said, I'm an avid consumer of the news, and on a Saturday and Sunday, I'll sit there and I'll read or I'll watch the long form news. And it's really important. I mean, staying informed is incredibly important to me. But, when you're doing the tram ride or the school pickup, or it's I think, and it's literally a habit. It's a scroll habit of when there's a downtime that's actually not, you're doing something, but you're not doing something. It's about picking up your phone, consuming the short bites, and then moving on. And maybe I just don't make enough time to do it on a daily basis. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it's very kind of common amongst people.
It's extremely common. But I mean,
yeah.
Your position is one where reading the news and following current affairs is kind of intrinsic to what you're doing for work. So imagine the vast majority of Australians who don't need to know what's happening in the news, what their appetite would be to read a long 1,500 word piece that I spend 3 days slaving over. It's just not relevant to most people's lives. And the attention economy is becoming so much more contested. Advertisers and tech firms are doing whatever they can to get our eyeballs onto a piece of content. So despite so many advances in technology and convenience across the board, the fact that I can order lunch right now and I'll collect it when the doorbell rings doesn't seem to be giving us the feeling of actually having more time to engage with in-depth material, which is incongruent and just like it sucks.
Yeah. Well, it must when you're slaving over those 1,500 word pieces and you think maybe someone will read 300 words of it and then move on to someone else.
Oh, I don't care who reads. As long as my mum reading it, she's happy. I'm all good.
Don't ever stop doing it, Paul. We need people like you. So let's turn our mind.
Nerds like you and me.
No, the political history. I studied politics and history as an arts degree, double major at Monash. No wonder we get on pretty well.
Yeah.
So we're turning our mind now to the upcoming federal election. It could be called sometime between here and May. People are talking about April. What are the media strategies for the Prime Minister and the opposition leader in the lead up to the election? Can you give us some kind of insights into their strategies, but also are they embracing these new platforms? So, well, they're not new at all, but are social media platforms going to play a more role in terms of the upcoming election and how they get their messages out?
Yeah, they absolutely are. And I think this is the first election where we're seeing both sides have a social media strategy that's right at the core of their communication strategy. In 2019, Scott Morrison hired a firm called Topham Guerin, which are a New Zealand-based firm which work with Conservative parties that are quite nifty on kind of memes. They really caught the crest of that meme wave in the latter part of the last
Yeah.
decade. And they did really well on, on TikTok. And they kind of outdid Labor in 2019, particularly on negative political ads against Bill Shorten. So that was it was a marginal part of the campaign. It wasn't right at the core. But in this election, and my colleague Olivia Ireland wrote this story a few weeks ago, there's a push from the very top of the Liberal Party and their head office, from their campaign strategists, for all MPs, including Dutton and his shadow cabinet. You're seeing a lot of this on Instagram and TikTok, doing vertical videos where they're speaking down the barrel, trying to be informal. Jane Hume, the shadow finance minister, is doing her cocktail making instructional videos, which are quite humorous. Dan Tehan, the immigration shadow, is talking about his officers' exercise routines. Peter Dutton's doing some quite funny clips on TikTok where, for example, Anthony Albanese is repeatedly shown saying Peter Dutton's name, and then Dutton just laughs it off and says, "This bloke's obsessed with me." So there's actually this quite coordinated approach that takes up a big proportion of their officers' time and creativity and thought patterns, which is trying to put them in front of different audiences. Peter Dutton very, very rarely does interviews with the mainstream press. He hasn't done a big sit-down newspaper interview for a long time, but he recently did a podcast with the Australian diver, Sam Fricker, and Mark
Yeah.
Bouris, the investment kind of guru. They're leaning into second-gen media.
Do you think it's more about driving recognition? I mean, obviously they're not out there talking about tax policy on TikTok. So is it more about simple like facial recognition or relatability, so people can see, think, vote rather than
They're selling,
understand and vote?
yeah, what they're selling is a vibe. They're trying to put forward to big, difficult to reach audiences who won't sit down and read the magazine lift out of the Saturday paper where you'd usually do a big profile piece introducing people to your family. Dutton's now got quite a lot of followers on TikTok, way more than the Prime Minister, and he's doing okay on Instagram as well. Labor is also in this space too, but I use the Conservative example because they'd traditionally be seen as a bit more backward than progressives on social media, which I think is not the case anymore. Now he's got a TikTok account where he puts out a kind of nicely put together video about his police background, him talking about his dirt bike that he has at home, humanizing him, showing him to different audiences that otherwise wouldn't be reached through my audience as a newspaper journalist.
So, great point that we're coming to, and I won't take credit for this question because this was actually your idea to talk about. So I think it's fantastic and you can own it. But people said that Joe Rogan won Donald Trump the election. That sounds like a really simplistic point of view, but it's one that gets a lot of mileage. Does that resonate here in Australia? I mean, you talked about TikTok, about Dutton doing a podcast. Australia have a sort of a second-gen media network that could reshape politics in the same way that highly listened to podcasts and highly, I guess, respected and somewhat credible people like Joe Rogan backing in Donald Trump shifted the view and then the voting patterns.
Yeah, this was, as anyone who followed US politics would know, this was a huge talking point throughout the campaign. Kamala Harris's reluctance to get involved with second-gen media, a greater emphasis on legacy outlets, whereas Trump was just going around the country talking to particularly kind of, what's the term? Manosphere kind of influencers, being Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan and others. There was obviously an exaggerated sense that, doing Joe Rogan gets you special support that coasts you to an election win. It's obviously not as simple as that. But Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese's teams are realising, and there's been evidence of this for about a year, that second-gen media, while it's not as big an influence in Australia, it is growing and has some effect on discourse. It's not, there aren't any characters in Australia with as big a following as a Joe Rogan. In fact, Joe Rogan is Australian's Joe Rogan. He's been at points in the top few most downloaded podcasts in Australia. But we've seen, Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese are pretty old school political figures. They're establishment guys who have been in Parliament for about 20 years. So we're seeing their kind of staid, more considered, very establishment approach to media rub up against this pressure that they would be receiving from their officers and from the head officers behind them in the political parties, which push them towards engaging with more informal, kind of less safe media spaces. The Prime Minister did the same podcast that Dutton did a couple of weeks ago with Mark Bouris this week. I've written a story a couple of weeks ago, which hasn't been published yet, about Labor during the last budget in May, inviting a bunch of influencers to Canberra to kind of make content behind the scenes of the budget and show what Labor was doing. There was also a previously unreported event in Sydney last, I think, August, where a bunch of Labor ministers, including Claire O'Neill, Tanya Plibersek and Katie Gallagher, so senior female ministers, met at a pub with a bunch of kind of women's policy influencers who spoke to them, conducted interviews, and put content out into their channels that didn't get picked up by the mainstream press at all. So we are seeing our political parties start to engage in creative ways with the kind of new media influencers.
Yeah, and it's a balance, I guess, between, like you said, the people in these roles who are really established, both in their careers and their ways of operating, coming to the public with greater vulnerability, and with that having a greater acceptance of the risks that follow, because it can go bad. I mean, you make a gaffe and that's viral. So it's a different way of operating, and I guess even for communications professionals like us, even working with people in the corporate world, there is a greater acceptance within organisations that are doing it well of this sense of vulnerability and talking about ourselves as a person. I mean, Matt Coleman from CBA, all I see is him doing podcasts. He's fantastic, and it's not about what's the state of the economy, but it's about how much sleep do I get and what's my leadership style. And, it's these personal human faces of people who before seemed somewhat untouchable and unrelatable that seem to be coming to the fore.
I hope Matt Common's not one of those LinkedIn guys who posts about their 3 a.m. wake-ups and steel-cut oats. He seems like he might be.
Look, yeah, I think he's pretty diligent, but it's, people kind of relate to that stuff in a sense, even if it's to roll your eyes and say, I'm never going to do that with my life. It's nice to know what people who are successful and have a perception of being really successful, how they do it.
Totally. And as you say I didn't know that about Common, but it's emblematic of this sense among comms people now that boring content is dead. Like the contestability of people's attention, the amount of demand on people's attention and the amount of content that we see every day, and there are so many different places we can get it, means that you've got to work really hard to get anyone's attention for more than 5 seconds. So boring doesn't work anymore. Boring political ads don't work anymore, because if you're watching an ad on TV and they pay millions for these ads, but it doesn't grab your attention, it's worthless. So these new media spaces are more risky and more prone to exposing gaffes, but it's also where you need to be to get attention, particularly among young people.
Well, even telling my network and the audience of Australia in Focus about new episodes and things, I can put up a static post, even if it has a summary and the links and everything. But what captures the most attention are these 30-second videos that I do later in the week of, I just spoke to so-and-so and this is what we talked about, go and listen. So it's also that moving, engaging content, and static and boring, it doesn't get any love. Yeah.
I should have dressed up to make a more interesting video.
You're fine. We all know journalists don't wear ties anymore, so that's okay. What about AI and the impact of AI in how Australians consume media? What's being pushed to us? How's that driving where we go and where we think?
I think it's still early to make judgments about what AI is going to do to journalism. News Corp, which publishes The Australian and the City tabloids, has signed a deal with ChatGPT, where ChatGPT can use content from News Corp to inform itself and spit out results, which is the opposite approach to the New York Times, which is suing ChatGPT in America. So we'll see what the outcomes will be there. Some would say News Corp is kind of selling its soul and the New York Times is fighting the good fight, but maybe News Corp has made a financially wise call and got ahead of the game.
Or they think they do it anyway.
A little known fact that was put out by Michael Miller, the Australian and Asian CEO of News Corp, I think last year, is that at that time, or maybe even 23, at that time, News Corp was making 3,000 articles, I think, per day. I just had this up. So it was 300 stories per week in News Corp websites were being written by AI. And they were on things like weather updates. So, for example, local news, for example, a southeastern suburbs in Melbourne News Corp website would put out a week-long weather story saying it's going to be blaring hot for a week. people should be inside. And that was written by AI. They did similar stories on traffic updates. So just stuff that you can scrape the
Pull from
internet
other sources, yeah.
and just pop online. Obviously, that kind of menial journalistic work may well be replaced by AI over time, and it's kind of unclear what effect that will have on jobs. But high value news breaking, investigative and opinion and analysis, I can't see that being replaced anytime soon, but maybe I'm self-interested there. Who knows? It is all a bit scary, but I think early days to see how AI will affect the media industry.
I'm glad you're not a weather journalist, because just like in so many industries, it seems that AI is going to have a really big impact on what you called those sort of more menial tasks, where that information can be gleaned from other sources and put together in a generative manner and pushed out to an audience. So certainly watch that space. With all of these changes, and there's AI, there's the way we consume news, there's the way algorithms are pushing things, and then there's the way that politicians, for example, are communicating with audiences through, like you said, the uptick in memes and short, snappy and movement content. Has this changed the way Australians have trust in politics? Does it cause it to be greater, less? How do you think we feel as a nation about politics, politicians and democracy?
Yeah, I think if you look at surveys and research on this, polls show that a lot of people think social media is a good tool that's enhanced your ability to be engaged with current affairs and democracy. You can quickly learn about information. You can be hooked up into a channel where you feel like you're hearing from the politician you support quickly in a more personal way, and you understand them better. So I think people do feel in a way that they can engage with politics more closely. But I think there's the downside to social media is quite obvious. There's a lot of worry about whether it feeds misinformation, whether it leads to siloing and polarization, and that's clearly having political ramifications around the world. Less so probably in Australia yet, but we tend to be a little bit behind the UK and the US in a whole bunch of things. So I think social media this is a much bigger question than a political reporter can answer, but it's created certainly a more frazzled and chaotic society. It's not to say it doesn't have its benefits; it absolutely does, but it's clearly leading to a more unpredictable, less kind of stable political, but kind of body politic, and also just media cycle. Media cycles are quite insane. You get a Donald Trump assassination attempt, and the next week you're onto a different topic and it's almost forgotten. So I think we're all adjusting. We're going through almost an experiment in human history with seeing how this unbelievable tool influences the way we communicate and the way we think about politics. Yes, we're all on the ride. It's bumpy. It's fun sometimes. It's crazy other times. We're all on it together.
Well, you're certainly one of the driving forces, Paul. So that's a good position, but also one with great responsibility. Now, last question, because I know you've got to actually go and do some work so we can read that interesting and insightful news that you do produce. But I'm interested in the top 3 issues that you think will shape the election debate. And this is a question without notice for our audience. So, Paul, what are the top 3?
That is a question without notice. I think it's so cliched to say this because I almost feel a bit nauseous every time I hear the person use the term cost of living. It's just cost of living crisis, but it really is the main game. Like Labor and the coalition are going to fight tooth and nail over the next few months to convince people that they're the better managers of the economy. And the key kind of influencer in that debate is going to be Michelle Bullock, the Reserve Bank governor. She's got 2 massive decisions in February and then April on whether to cut rates. The April decision could be in the election campaign or just before the campaign date. So that could absolutely be a late election surprise. I think that the other, I'm not sure about my third, but I'd say the second one will be this question of kind of national identity and social attitudes. Peter Dutton is right at his core as a political operator is this sense that Australia is losing traditional values, that progressive causes are kind of eroding what makes Australia great. He's been on this since the late 90s. He's not reacting to the kind of anti-woke movement that we're seeing in the ascendancy across the world. It very much is him. It's his authentic self. So I think there'll be this big debate about, yes, cost of living, but in a kind of more top line sense, whether Dutton presents a kind of more retrograde country. And on the Conservative side, the argument will be that Albanese represents a progressive culture that is not good for the economy, that's not good for Australians' sense of self and sense of stability in an unstable world. And there'll be this contest about what Labor will say is a more modern outlook on their part, whereas on the Conservative side, what Dutton will say is a more traditional but stable and safe world under his leadership.
Which really is not dissimilar to what we've just seen in the US.
Yeah, not hugely. I think you're seeing these debates around culture and national identity play out across the West. There's this inversion happening where conservative voting people are often doing so not out of being wealthier and looking out for their financial interests, as conservative voters used to do until the kind of 80s or 90s when this inversion started, but they're voting conservative out of more cultural concern. And often the Labor Party, now the old party of the working class, is actually supported by, more commonly, not that the inversion hasn't fully occurred, but more commonly Labor has been supported by wealthier people, lawyers, public servants, people who are on higher incomes than the kind of more precarious working class outer suburban voters that Peter Dutton's targeting.
It's certainly incredibly interesting. And even though 3 years between elections doesn't feel like a long time, I think technologically, in terms of the way that Australia thinks about our identity and then how that all translates into votes and into what kind of government is formed in the next election, it's also interesting. It really is.
We'll see how it all plays out.
That's right. Well, thank you for being with Australia in Focus, Paul. Hopefully one day this might be a podcast that is as high rating as Joe Rogan's in Australia, but one can only keep working hard. So
This will be the launch pad.
Yeah, this will be the launch pad. It's wonderful talking with you. That has been really, really interesting and insightful. So thank you very much, Paul, for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Australia in Focus with Paul Sakkal. It certainly was an interesting discussion with lots more to come in the way that Australians engage with politics and the media in this day and age. You can follow along with Paul's analysis and journalism at Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And remember to follow along with Australia in Focus on LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify and Apple. We'll see you next time.